Welcome to part one of my canoe building series of videos, and I thought I'd begin in this video by just giving you some basic terminology and concepts so that in later videos you'll be able to understand what I'm talking about. So here we can see a drawing of the style of canoe I'll be building. It is known as a prospector style canoe, 16 foot long, and there are various types of canoe that you can build, and this is known as a skin on frame canoe, which means that a fabric is stretched over a wooden frame to form the hull. So in building a canoe like this, the first thing that we need to be concerned with is the mould on which we build the canoe. And the canoe is built upside down on this mould, and we can see in this picture here a diagram of what a canoe mould looks like. If we take the stand that the mould sits on away, the most basic form of mould used to build a canoe looks just like this. The base of the mould is a long flat plank which we call a strongback, and this forms the straight rigid spine of the mould. The next important part of the mould is what is known as the forms or stations, and they are a number of upright flat boards which form the shape of the hull. The first part of the actual canoe itself is the stem, and this is a curved board, usually made out of plywood, which forms the shape of the stern and the bow of the hull at each extreme end. Running down the center of the underneath side of the hull is a long straight piece of timber known as the keel or keelson, and the two stems are attached to this piece of timber. Next, stretching from stem to stem, curving around the outside shape of the hull, are a number of thin strips of wood which we know as stringers, and the stringers are fastened to the form stations in order to hold them in place and keep their shape. Here we have a sort of a cutaway view of what the stringers look like as they are wrapped around the form stations to form the basic framework of the hull, which the fabric will be stretched over as the last step of constructing the canoe. At the bottom of the row of stringers down each side is another piece of timber which is thicker than the stringers, and it is known as the gunwale. Now if we look at this diagram, it shows us the mould flipped right way up, and this diagram is slightly different than the first one that I used because it's from the original plans for the prospector canoe that I will make. And the first thing you might notice here is that the strongback on this design of mould is not a long flat horizontal board, it's a long flat vertically placed board that the form stations slot onto. And with the mould turned right way up like this, we can now see more clearly where the gunwales are and the stems at each end. So when we're considering different plans that we might use as the basis for building a canoe, the most important part of those plans are the patterns for the form stations, because the form stations are what give the boat its unique shape and form, and if we only have the form station patterns, we can pretty much piece together everything else that we need in order to build a canoe. But if the form station plans are not there, then pretty much we can't build the canoe. So we can see here on this diagram a very typical representation of what the patterns for the form stations look like in a lot older format for canoe plans. In the case of the canoe that I'm building, the patterns for the form stations are drawn out on a grid which is made up of inch squares. To understand how we make the form stations, let's have a look at form station number 3 and its pattern here in this diagram. So we take a sheet of paper and we draw out a 1 inch square grid. Looking at this pattern, we can count how many squares down, how many squares wide, and then we reproduce the pattern of this side of the number 3 form station on that gridded square pattern. So each form is made up of 2 mirror image parts, just like this. So we repeat the number 3 pattern twice when we draw it out on our plywood that we're going to cut out to make our number 3 form station. And then these 2 sides mirror images of the number 3 pattern are bolted together with what is called a cleat, and we can see in this diagram here what that completed number 3 form station looks like. Because the canoe is symmetrical side to side and end to end, we need to make 2 of these number 3 form stations, which means that we need to cut out 4 number 3 sides. We join 2 together to make the front number 3 form, and we join 2 together to make the back number 3 form. And in the case of this particular canoe, that means we will have 7 forms altogether, and the very middle form we only make 1 of. So this little arrow here shows us where the strong back will slot into the form on the particular mould method I will be using. And the keelson slots into this gap here at the bottom. These 2 side notches are where the gunnels slot in. So there are last couple of extra bits of the canoe to consider now. Here we see what's called the deck, and the deck slots in at the end of the gunnels where they meet the stems. Next we have the thwarts, which are 2 long flat pieces of timber which go from gunnel to gunnel and hold the canoe shape apart. Most canoes have 3 thwarts. This diagram only shows 2 in this particular plan. There are 2 seats in a canoe this long, the bow seat at the front and the stern seat at the back, and this is how we can tell which way the canoe goes around, which is the stern and which is the bow, because of the positions of the seats. The stern seat being closer to the stem of the canoe, and the bow seat being closer to the center of the canoe and away from the stem. And lastly, here on the inside of the hull of the canoe, we can see the ribs which lay on the inside of the stringers for the full length of the canoe. So that's all the basic terminology that you need in order to understand what on earth I'm talking about in the coming videos when you see me actually building this canoe, this 16-foot Prospector skin-on frame canoe. So I hope that's some help.